The Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by Alberta Grains, C&M Seeds, and Syngenta Canada. Find more episodes of The Wheat School by going to wheatschool.com. Sean Haney here with Real Agriculture for another episode of The Wheat School, joined right now by Dr. Brian Beres. He's research scientist at AAFC in Lethbridge. Brian, great to chat with you.
Yeah, likewise, Sean.
Okay, so today on the Wheat School, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a concept that probably a lot of people have seen on a slide at a presentation at one time and kind of gets skipped over, and you're like, okay, what the heck does that stand for? G by E by M, and that is genotype by environment by management. Okay, so explain this concept to us.
Yeah, gladly. I'm the one to blame for it. Sorry, real ag people out there. But I didn't invent it. It was kind of it's more of a universally used term for, when I started in agronomy, we had guys like George Clayton talking about integrated crop management and just that holistic approach, but a more universally accepted global acronym is G by E by M. And I kind of like it. And I only got to learn about it when I got pulled into the Wheat Initiative, a global organization. And so when we started, fostering relations with other agronomists around the world, they kind of like clued me in. But the reason I like it is, and it's part of the rationale for the Wheat Initiative inception of it is we've all heard G by E. If you haven't been to grad school, that's for sure. And you don't know too many breeders, let me tell you. But G by E on the breeding thing has been around forever. And then you sort of had management and by environment over here. So kind of two silos.
Yeah.
And, neither one of them then, in my mind, leads to the type of attainment that we especially need now. And so there's always been this idea, like, how do we bring that together? And so it's all about fostering, a cross-disciplinary approach to, solving a problem or exploiting an opportunity.
So is it kind of looking the full picture? Like instead of it being like you mentioned, like two silos sort of in 2D, we're now looking at it in 3D and seeing how all three of these connect and how they interact with each other and how that turns into the outcome, essentially yield.
Yeah, exactly. And or whatever variable you're thinking about, right? And usually most of what we're doing, especially when we're, trying to deliver something to the farm gate, is there's got to be something yield driven in there. It's all about, it's not it's trying to get that multiplicative synergy out of an additive formula, right?
Yeah.
Really what it's about.
So for the farmer who's trying to take advantage of this principle, they choose a variety and they usually choose that based on trialing data or, with word of mouth, or they talk to people like yourself. There's trials, different. They choose a variety that's tied to the environment and some of the results. And we've seen, at least I've heard about it a lot more from like in corn, where you have certain management practices for a certain corn hybrid. But now, we're sort of identifying we can do this in wheat, for example,
Oh,
as well.
well, I think we're getting there. I think, I'll give you a different example.
Yeah.
The work we're doing in ultra early seeding, for example, like when I first came up with that concept, I was 1,000% convinced we would need special genetics, right? But what we found was, by default of breeding programs being in the northerly latitudes, I mean, a default of that is that they're bred for tolerance to cold abiotic stress. And so we didn't need special genetics. So the G part on ultra early seeding systems right now isn't a big deal because they all do well pretty much.
Hmm.
But I think in the future, it could become a really prominent piece to that model because I think it introduces a platform where we could, people have used this term flex wheat, where it's like, okay, do we have some genetics or a trait that would really enhance, an ultra early seeding system for whatever different reason, or if somebody's looking at adapting it to a different crop, what has to happen on the G side. So I think, whereas with the sawfly thing, I think it was already there, a huge G component, and it was the management piece that needed to get built up a bit more, which we did a pretty good job of. And whereas there's other examples where it's not always going to be fully balanced, at the beginning, but I think it allows you to take a look at, what needs to be a focus. Like right now, I think when you look at fertility, for example, nitrogen management, often we don't see huge variety differences. There's times when you'll see, like the one we just did right now, older genetics like a Stettler, when it's really, really dry, actually at times will beat out a more modern one like Viewfield, for example, whereas Viewfield in just about every high productivity environment is like obviously way better, right? So it's in the future, I think, trying to understand in a drought situation or something like that, what are these little traits within that G that would enhance the other pieces to it? And in Australia, almost a classic example now is this idea for drought tolerance and water use efficiency is moving to or trying to develop these long coleoptile wheats so that you can, they'll go down and scavenge for water and nutrients more so than a conventional wheat. So just some examples of the importance or the opportunity within each of those components, and then the challenge of weaving it all together.
So in terms of weaving it all together, how does the farmer know what to do? Is this based on farm trials? Is there
Well,
extension they can access? Like how do they know what to do?
yeah, no, sorry to get back to your point. Yeah, that's a great question because I think right now maybe we've got a bit of a knowledge gap where we're, on one hand, we're doing a really good job of showing the when and where for some of these genetics. Sawfly was one that could get scaled up right away, ultra early scale up right away because the genetics aren't that big. But then you get somebody like, yeah, like you said, the yield enhancement network. There's
Yep.
some private entities, what is it, Ultimate Yield, those folks really focusing on a collection of farmers trying to understand specifically on their farm what's going to work. So I think there's opportunity or maybe a need for agronomists to more closely team up with farmers to sort of get that gap bridge between the research and the on farm for sure. I think it's a great question.
Hmm. Well, and I there's three pieces of this. Genotype in our control, the management in our control. The environment is one that's a little bit out of our control. Like, geography is in our control. Like
Yeah.
we know it. It's a known entity. But environment encompasses a lot more, like weather conditions on that given year. So that creates some variability in terms of this math equation too.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why, you know, don't be putting all your chips on one horse. It could be, what land bases are like. It could be like maybe if you really want to intensify, maybe that requires multiple genetics, or multiple market classes at a minimum, because some market classes, by virtue of the genetic background of those wheat varieties, may do better on your piece of land than a different one. And I think that's kind of the interesting thing about this. And then, that environment, sometimes it's impossible, if it's like a severe drought, there's the way there's no point worrying about micronutrients when you have a 20 bushel maximum yield potential that year, right? Or some of these other things like, um, even genetics, but genetics to a certain degree, you could still manipulate and get the most out of that year. Maybe changing crop phases and all that kind of stuff. So I think sometimes if you can predict it, right? And I think that's where the next phase is. If you focus on the E part, it's all about being able to predict that environment, and then with enough lead time, being able to manipulate the M and the G to just, either just manage through it or totally exploit it. And that's kind of what we did with ultra early. And even, the sawfly, that insect, that's the environment, right?
Yeah.
So it's sometimes within your control, but yeah, sometimes, Mother Nature's just coming at you, and you know what she can be like in a situation like that.
Oh, we know, unfortunately. Eh, Brian, you said back in time we sort of looked at this as like a two-dimensional sort of way of looking at it, and in isolation, two different silos. In the future, is there a potential for is there a fourth dimension to this where we'll add something to this, or this 3D view is this all encompassing?
What do you think? I'm the amazing Kreskin or something? Like I'm trying my best here.
I don't know. I'm just curious. I'm thinking about the
No.
future.
Well, I don't know if there would be something to add to it. Um, because honestly, how much are we actually doing of it right now? I think more to the point would be, you know, in certain situations or in certain contexts, whether it's nitrogen management or insect management, when the G is real small, how do we make it bigger to make a bigger impact? Or if the M's small, and think about the yield gap, right? All this stuff, the interplay of all this is why we're getting that yield gap or why we're closing it. So I think
Mm.
I think the fourth piece to it might be, you know, being able to have a feedback loop to the farm, back to it, to feed into it, to understand what do I need to change. And that's kind of, back to the yield gap study again, is like, okay, focusing in or being able to predict what I need to change and being adaptable or open to the change to see it through as well. Like John Kirkgard up out of Australia has a great paper where, he's got four components or whatever in this slide that, and they don't have a big yield potential in some of their regions. Like all these components were about 1.4 tons per acre. But he showed if you manipulated strategically those components that were all representing a G by E by M synergy, you tripled your yield to 4.5 tons, I believe. So it's, you know what I mean? So it's
Yeah.
it's really that, to being a student of it and mindful of it and not just obsessing, because let's be honest, we have a lot of obsession on some of the components, you know, at the cost of others.
Hmm.
Whether you're talking about a farmer, a seed salesman, a funder, we've all got our bias. And I think the challenge that G by E by M puts to everybody is like, can you lay that bias aside and be open to the fact that we need to like pay attention to all those components instead of even if everything you have is based on one of them, can you be open enough to like say they all need attention?
Brian, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Wheat School.
Yeah, my pleasure, Sean.